Thanks for coming, everybody. And thank you, Maria, for inviting me. Where's Maria?
Well, not just me, but the wellness team of Elizabeth, I, and Andrea.
I thought it might have something to do with the fact that I found out that you invited Rick before you invited me, and I shamed you into, Well, I decided I would start with a short introduction of myself, and that I came into this world in Los Angeles. And if you were interested, you could get there from here by heading south, and you would probably recognize it when you got there. This is where I spent my formative years before I came to Davis for my graduate training. Of course, the campus looked a little different at that time, but we have since grown some really nice administration buildings, and we've recruited our top people to work there. And if you ever wondered what becomes of administrators after we're finished with them, they're up there, looking down on us, just like they did when they were here on Earth. I wanted to start by accepting that disease is not necessarily beautiful. We all know it can be a tragic thing. Outbreaks, the emergence of new pathogens, and even more tragic, really, diseases that we know how to prevent and control still kill hundreds of thousands of people every year. And if we look back in time, we can see a history of plagues that killed millions of people. Estimated that maybe as many as 50% of the population in Europe died during the 14th century because of the Black Death, but a lot of historians think that actually helped set the stage for the reflowering of the arts and sciences, the Renaissance. The question I want to start with here is whether or not disease can be beautiful. Anybody think that's true? Yeah. Yeah, and here's the very simple answer. Obviously, it can be beautiful. Who knows what this is caused by? Yeah, it's a virus. It's called flower breaking. The shocking thing is nobody actually really knows how it works, near as I can tell from looking in the literature. But the virus presumably affects the accumulation of the pigment, and the result is that pattern, which is quite valuable. Now, when I talk about disease, I'm talking specifically about infectious disease. So this would be caused by a parasitic organism, and that would include bacteria, fungi, and viruses, at least for the ones that I will be talking about. And you might ask this question, why are there parasites? Why can't everybody just make an honest living? It's a very simple answer for that. Every living organism is a resource because at the cellular level, there are no real differences in the constituents. The ultimate constituents are universal across cellular life, and that means that all organisms contain all the nutrients required for life. All organisms, including people. You can imagine yourself as a microbe strolling down the aisle in the supermarket, examining the food labels, and you would see humans, excellent source of protein, and everything else you need. The perfect food for you and your family. Consequently, it's fair to say that any uninfected organism, possibly even some that are already infected, are an unexploited habitat that can be utilized. Consequently, natural selection favors parasitism. It's undeniable. But that doesn't mean parasites are necessarily common. So most of the organisms that we encounter day to day are free living, or at least would appear to be so, possible exception of trial lawyers. But there's reason to suspect that for every free living species, there is at least one unique parasite. So that, in other words, would be a parasite that specializes on that host, at least one. Of course, we haven't tested every species, but to the extent that people have looked, like at insects, you can find one. What you see in both cases here is spore-producing structures of a fungus that has colonized the ant, and in this case, the grasshopper. So likely every free-living species has at least one unique parasite, and we should note that even parasites have parasites. So here we can see this is the hypha of a fungus, and here is another fungus preparing to parasitize it. It's not really a stretch to suggest that parasites are actually the most common life form on Earth. That's at least a reasonable hypothesis. And I'm going to illustrate the abundance of parasites using the bacteriophage as an example. So a bacteriophage is a virus that infects bacteria. Find them wherever you have bacteria, including seawater. And people have made estimates of the abundance of bacteriophages in seawater, the upper surface about 10 billion per liter, and multiply that by about 3.8 to get the number per gallon. Well, there are a lot of liters of water in the ocean, and estimates are that if you look at all the oceans of the Earth, you would have 10 to the 30th bacteriophages. That would be 1 with 30 zeros after. That's a very large number. Larger even than all the administrators at University of California. Since we can't easily grasp the magnitude of that number, I'm going to do a little exercise here to illustrate it. Taking the size of the bacteriophage, they're quite small, it's about a millionth, less than a millionth of a meter, but we'll put them all end to end, all 10 to the 30th of the bacteriophages. So we multiply that by the number that we think might be in the ocean, and what we get is 10 million light years. So light years, how far light travels in a year. And that approximates 6.7 times the diameter of the galaxy in which we live. That's just viruses affecting bacteria in the surface water of the ocean. It is fair to say that all life forms are threatened by parasitic microbes. Even humans. But the good news here is that this is edible. This is an edible mushroom right here. It's a chanterelle. In spite of this, in spite of the ever-present threat of parasitism, life on Earth has flourished. The biosphere is populated by millions of species. How is this possible? How have free-living life forms escaped the ravages of parasitism? Do you remember? I talked about this in the class you took. But only part of it.
Oh, you didn't know there would be a quiz?
Back when Johan was a sprout, we wrote this article together. And it goes into this question in some detail, and if you find yourself in need of sleep in the future, you could consult this. I'm only going to touch on one aspect of it, but what I think is probably the most important aspect of how free-living life forms escape destruction by parasitism, and that is that they change over time through the power of genetic recombination. A species changes over time through sexual reproduction. And that is simply a matter of mom and dad each contribute half their chromosomes, they get reshuffled, recombined, and consequently, all of the kids are different. They're different from each other, they're different from their parents. And that's important because if there's a parasite that can have its way with mom or dad, it won't necessarily do so well with the kids because they are genetically different. That's what genetic recombination does. And this idea, the idea that this form of reproduction is defense against parasitism, is captured in the Red Queen hypothesis, which makes the analogy to Alice's conversation with the Red Queen. The point being that for a species to survive, it has to change continuously over the generations, and that's what sexual reproduction does. It continually reshuffles the alleles, and every generation you have new genotypes. Now, I also want to point out that if you come up with a scientific hypothesis, best to give it a cool name. People will pay attention. Not long after that was published, book titles, manuscripts, grant proposals, still, people love it. The reason why it was of interest to biologists is because it was really troubling that sexual reproduction was so common in nature. The reason it was unexpected is that if an individual survives to reproductive age, that means that individual was well adapted to the environment in which it dwelled. Why would it be a good strategy to dilute the genome by 50%? You've got a genotype that's fit, well adapted to the environment, and then it dilutes it by half. Now, the explanation is, if we accept that hypothesis, that it's an adaptation to parasitism. Continual change in the array of genotypes with every generation, and that can help to explain why it is indeed a universal feature of life. So that's the biological side of it. The sociological side, of course, for those of us of the mammalian persuasion, it has another dimension, and we might think of it, for example, as the prelude for the development of meaningful, enduring relationships. Now, we don't attribute those kind of feelings to plants, but the same imperative is there. That is the need to reshuffle the genes every generation so as to reduce the risk of parasitism. And the means by which they do that is sexual reproduction, and the structures and the modes of delivery are different, but the essence of the process is the same. And in the case of flowering plants, it's a matter of moving pollen from an anther sac to the stigmatic surface, and that's what brings the gametes together. And of course, to constitute recombination, it would have to be moving the pollen from one flower to the stigmatic surface on a different flower, a flower on a different individual. That would allow for recombination to occur, and that can be facilitated by what kind of creatures? Yeah, that's right. And other insects. And it's going to be most efficient for the plant if the insect has a degree of specificity. So in other words, it would collect pollen from a flower and it would deliver the pollen to a flower on a plant of the same species. That would maximize the efficiency and the seed set that would result. And it's also fair to say that plants are competing for pollinators. Lots of plants, and those that are most effective at attracting pollinators will set the most seed, leave the most progeny to the next generation. Now I want to go through the line of logic that leads to support for my hypothesis. Flowers attract pollinators, and that's necessary for sexual reproduction, which allows for genetic recombination and the moving target over time, an adaptation to parasitism. Therefore, it is because of disease that we can enjoy this beautiful display of wildflowers every year. And soon you can go out and see many of them. All these are pictures taken in California, and this one you'll be able to find in Jefferson Prairie very soon. That, I would say, is a reason to think of disease as beautiful. Consequence of disease is that we have all these beautiful flowers. Plants have other ways of minimizing the risk of parasitism, and particularly in the case of annual plants, they can be quite diminutive in stature. That's good because in order to become infected, a spore or a cell or an insect carrying a virus needs to find the plant. So the smaller they are, the less likely they are to be found. Annual plants can have the advantage of being small and unlikely to be detected. They can also have the advantage of being transitory. Some plants go from seed to seed in less than a couple of months. And likewise, the less time they are in vegetative condition, the less opportunity there is for infection. So compare that to a tree. A tree is in the same place for a very long time, centuries in some cases. Very slow to set seed. That can take decades. And it's the same genotype in the same place for a very long time. So trees cannot take advantage of these adaptations that I've described, and that, I would suggest, is an important part of the reason why annuals are much more common than perennials. Because it is much easier to minimize the risk of disease with the annual habit as opposed to perennial. However, some trees have endured, and in fact, some of them are among the oldest living things on Earth. To explain how that can be achieved, I want to start with the tropics, where we find a tremendous, in fact, that's where most of the tree species are. Probably over 95% of the known tree species would be found in the tropics. At a high level of diversity, up to 250 trees per acre. And that's important because that means for any given individual, the trees closest to it will be a different species. And why is that important? Or isn't it? That constrains disease transmission. So a pathogen cannot move directly from one individual to another if the nearby individuals are a different species. That's good with respect to reducing the risk of disease. It's not good if you are interested in a particular species of tree, like the tree that makes the latex that we turn into rubber. So if you wanted to collect rubber from these trees, you'd have to spend a lot of time looking for them because there's only about one tree per acre in the Amazon rainforest, which is the native range of the rubber tree. Well, this was a problem for Henry because he wanted to make millions of cars and each car needed rubber for tires. So he decided, since he could afford it, that he would buy some property. Bought some land in the Brazilian rainforest and started a plantation. Lots of rubber trees, looked good. He was feeling pleased with himself, no doubt, until the canopy closed and a disease appeared. Rubber leaf blight, defoliated the trees, they all died. No more rubber. What he did for us is he falsified the hypothesis that you can grow an individual species at high density in the tropics. He did an experimental test of that hypothesis and he showed it cannot be done, and he repeated the experiment. The same thing happened. So on that basis and other evidence that I won't be getting into, we can say that leaf-infecting fungi promote diversity in the tropical rainforests because they make it impossible for a species to grow in close proximity to conspecifics. So that's nice. Biologists like diversity. But it's nice for another reason too, because a diversity of tropical trees means a diversity of tropical fruit. Something you can enjoy every day if you choose to. So all this works out very well in the tropics because it's warm and wet pretty much all the time. It's a fungus incubator. Great place to be a fungus. Moisture, warm temperature, ideal for infection. But of course, trees grow in lots of other areas besides the tropics. And in those areas, we see something rather different. Boreal forests, for example, Canada also extending through Siberia and Scandinavia. Lots of trees, but not very many different species. In fact, in some areas, you might go a long way before you would see more than one. Part of the reason for that is it's cold and dry most of the time. When there's water present, it's usually frozen, so you don't get a lot of fungal infections of the above ground parts of the plant. So you don't have a lot of diversity. But the trees survive in part because they are really tough. When plants moved from an aquatic environment onto land, they needed to produce durable structures that would allow them to extend up into the atmosphere, and that was facilitated by the evolution of the polymer that we call lignin. It's not actually a molecule in the strict sense of the word because it's just 3 different subunits attached in a wide variety of ways, and it's really difficult for microbes to degrade. Part of that is because there are so many different chemical bonds. Nobody really knows exactly how many, but there are certainly over 30. And if you think, okay, you need a different enzyme for each chemical bond, that's a lot to expect. But it's worse than that because enzymes are proteins, they're big molecules, and they can't really diffuse into the lignin. Very difficult to degrade, and that provides an important protective function for all trees, some more than others. And on top of that, trees produce a wide array, literally thousands of different antimicrobial organic molecules. And any fungus growing on a tree has to be able to deal with them. It has to be able to tolerate them or detoxify them. Those chemicals, the antimicrobial chemicals, are found in the core of the tree, what's called the heartwood. And heartwood is not alive, but it provides important structural support. It took a long time, literally millions of years. If you've heard of the Carboniferous period, that was the period after plants colonized the land, but before fungi evolved the capacity to break down lignin. And during that time, lots of wood accumulated, and a lot of it turned into coal. Some of it burned, of course. Well, a lot of the coal burned too, but that came later. Now, we do have quite a few fungi that have developed the capacity to break down the heartwood. So they have overcome those barriers. The challenge of breaking down lignin and the need to tolerate antimicrobial metabolites. And many of them will grow on trees while they're still alive. You can find some of them on campus. Up until about 3 years ago, you could have seen this one. This is at the base of a hackberry tree right across the street from the Sciences Lecture Hall. The tree's gone now, and the reason it's gone is because once the fungus emerges and produces this structure, that means it's already grown extensively in the heartwood. And that means the tree becomes a hazard. There's a risk of it coming down in a windstorm. This tree was actually a long way from that, but facilities decided to err on the side of caution and take it out. But many trees will stand for a long time without very much of their heartwood left. In the forest, if you look around enough, you can find these so-called hollow trees. Hollow trees actually have an important function. For example, they provide habitat for cavity nesting birds. And in fact, some wildlife biologists will shoot trees with buckshot laced with fungal spawn to create those openings. Maybe it works, maybe they just like to shoot guns, I don't know. In addition to birds, we have small mammals that make their dens in hollowed out trees. And as you may know, of course, it's one of the greatest attractions for everyone's best friend. Now, it is true that trees that have lost much of their heartwood are at greater risk of failure, and ultimately those trees will come down in a windstorm or lightning strike, and that's sad perhaps for the tree, but it's good for the forest. And the reason is because when a tree goes down, it opens up a gap, and the gap allows sunlight to reach the forest floor. And that's important because that allows seedlings to grow. And those seedlings, of course, will grow into saplings and ultimately into canopy level trees to replace those that die. So what we see as detrimental to an individual, i.e. the tree that falls down, is actually beneficial to the community. In fact, arguably is actually essential to ensure that regeneration takes place. Trees are hard to degrade, and yet over time, for any given tree, we can typically find an array of fungi that can degrade the heartwood. But there are exceptions, and one of them is a tree that everybody already knows about. What's that tree? Thank you, Andrea. It's redwood. And redwood has come up with a combination of antimicrobial chemicals and structural barriers that no fungi have been able to overcome. It's resistant to decay, and at least in its natural environment, there are no diseases. No diseases to speak of. So we might say that redwoods have won the battle against fungi, but we can put it in the category of a Pyrrhic victory. They may well have lost the war. And the reason is because the longer an individual lives, the less turnover you have in the population. And that's important because turnover allows for incremental adaptations to the environment as it changes over time. And in the case of redwood, where nothing kills them, they don't have much turnover in their population, and so forego the opportunity to accumulate adaptations gradually over time as the environment changes. And of course, we all know that the climate is changing, or at least most of us know that. And here we have the range of the redwood. It can't move, climate's going to change, and this could be a problem for any native vegetation, but it's particularly problematic for a species that is very long-lived and so has very little turnover. So here again, we can see disease as something that kills individuals is actually beneficial to a species by enforcing that turnover in the population. Now, I wanted to say one more thing about wood decay fungi because they do some interesting things that people have taken advantage of. Here you can see these dark lines. This is referred to as spalted wood. And the dark line is like a demilitarized zone. On each side, you have a different fungal genotype. They're fighting with each other. They're killing each other. And that's what creates the dark line. We also have what's called blue stain wood, and that's also caused by a fungus that produces a pigment that gives the wood a blue color. Artisans have taken an interest in this kind of wood, and spalted wood in particular, it's difficult to work with because it tends to shatter, but people have figured out how to do it and make lots of interesting things out of them, like this nice bowl and even boomerangs. And everybody knows what you call the boomerang that doesn't come back. That's a stick. So these are the things I think that we can point to as a reason to say that disease can be beautiful, things that we can enjoy because of the ever-present threat of parasitic disease. And one other thing I would like to leave you with, and that is that at least in the case of plants, the symptoms themselves can be beautiful, I think, undeniably. Looking at that, I have to wonder, why would anybody want a calendar with a stupid bird on it if instead they could have this beautiful disease of the month calendar, a new disease every month for as long as you maintain your subscription? So thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to try and answer questions. Yeah. Thank you.